$10 million, that was the cost of my silence, tossed into the air like a joke. A cruel and arrogant boast hurled by the most dangerous man in New York. Dante Valerio, the capo who ruled the city with a blooded iron fist and who believed, with complete certainty, that I was nothing more than a waitress. Invisible and expendable, as he laughed and flung a crumbling ancient letter onto the table, daring anyone to decipher a code that had defeated the world's finest cryptographers. Never knowing who I really was, or that by reading those 3 lines, I wouldn't just be winning a bet but signing my own death warrant. While the air in Laurel, always heavy with truffle oil, expensive cologne, and fear. Mostly fear wrapped around me as Selene adjusted the collar of her stiff white uniform and kept her head down, moving through the maze of velvet booths. A ghost by design. Because being Selene the waitress was safe, and being Dr. B, Selene Rostova, the youngest linguistics professor ever disgraced and exiled from Cambridge University, was dangerous. And here among clinking crystal and murmured high society gossip, she remained invisible until tonight. Because tonight table 10 belonged to Dante Valerio. And even without looking up, she felt him there. The atmosphere shifting the moment he entered, the music dulling, diners stiffening, and Mr. Henderson sweating through his suit. For Dante Valerio wasn't just a mob boss, but the head of the Valerio Syndicate. A man whose rumored net worth rivaled small countries and whose temper was legendary. And when his shout of "incompetent, all of you," shattered the room's polite hum, Selene froze near the service station, gripping a pitcher of water as Dante stood and slammed his hand onto the mahogany table. Devastatingly handsome with slick-back dark hair, a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and storm-colored eyes, yet terrifying in the rage pouring off him as his 2 suited bodyguards flinched and the elderly man across from him, trembling, figure in a tweed jacket who looked like a librarian, lost in a Shark Tank, wilted under Dante's hissed demand. About $50,000 and gibberish. Stammering excuses about archaic dialects and pre-Roman syntax before Dante growled for him to be removed before his tongue was cut out. The guards dragging the whimpering translator away as Dante slumped back, ran a hand over his face, and pulled from his inner pocket a fragile yellowed parchment he stared at with hatred and desperation. Watched by Selene despite knowing she should look away. Because even from 10 feet the ink pattern called to her. Unmistakable as a cipher, not merely a letter. Until Mr. Henderson shoved a bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux into her hands and ordered her to table 10 without eye contact, forcing Selene to steel her nerves and walk toward the lion's den. Overhearing Dante mutter to his scarred right-hand man Luca about the commission, the reserves, his father's legacy, and the death of the Valerio family without that money. Snapping that there were no experts left as he drained his whiskey, looked up at the parchment, and loudly mocked the silent restaurant with an offer of $10 million to anyone who could tell him what the damn thing said. Sneering at a room full of cowards and sheep while Selene's hand hovered over his glass and her eyes traced the script. Recognizing not just Sicilian but a variation of Oscan overlaid with a Vigenère cipher. Complex and brilliant and solvable, seeing instantly that the recurring symbols were coordinates disguised as vowels. Pouring the wine without spilling a drop before the truth slipped from her lips in a whisper. "It's not gibberish." And the silence that followed crushed the air as Dante froze. Slowly turned, took in her cheap uniform, messy bun, and fraying apron. Murmured, "Excuse me," in a dangerously soft voice, while Mr. Henderson rushed forward apologizing and calling her an idiot. Only to be silenced as Dante stood towering over Selene and asked what she'd said. Her heart hammering like a trapped bird as she fought the urge to apologize or flee. Because the same intellectual vanity that had destroyed her career at Cambridge flared alive once more. She couldn't stand seeing a beautiful puzzle insulted. And so she spoke, saying, "It's not gibberish," Selene said. Her voice shaking but clear, The translator was wrong. It's not pre-Roman, it's Oscan, but it's written backward using a shift cipher based on the Gregorian calendar. And Dante stared at her, for a second looking as if he might laugh, scoffing that a waitress knows Oscan, while Celine murmured that she wasn't always a waitress, prompting Dante to cross his arms as the arrogance returned, and he challenged her. All right. You want to play, you heard the offer, $10 million. Prove it, gesturing to the parchment and leaning in so close his breath was hot against her ear as he promised that if she was wrong he'd take the hand she used to pour his wine as payment for wasting his time. While Mr. Henderson whimpered somewhere behind them and Celine focused on the parchment, not needing to write anything down because she had an eidetic memory, a curse that made her brilliant and a burden that left her unable to forget her past mistakes. The letters rearranging themselves in her mind as she realized the message wasn't about money reserves at all, but something far more personal and far more dangerous. Until Dante pressed her and she met his gaze. Brown eyes locked with stormy blue and began steadily, saying the wolf does not hide the gold in the den. The gold is the blood of the traitor who sits at your right hand. The glass in Luca's hand shattering as Dante didn't blink or move, the air around him turning to ice while he whispered for her to read the signature. And Selena squinted at the final glyph and said Amor Gabriella, draining the color from Dante's face because Gabriella was his mother. Dead 20 years, and no one except his father had known Wolf was his pet name. Dante turning to Luca, who stared at the table with blood on his hand and guilt written across his face as the restaurant fell deadly silent, and Dante calmly ordered the room cleared. Luca starting to speak before Dante roared and flipped the heavy oak table. Chaos erupting as patrons screamed and fled, and Mr. Henderson ran while Celine stood frozen, the parchment fluttering to the floor between her and the most dangerous man in the city as Dante drew a silver pistol in one smooth motion, aiming not at Luca but at Celine and telling her she was coming with him. Her stammering about the money and his promise only for Dante to laugh coldly and say she'd either saved his life or ended it, and either way she knew too much. Gripping her wrist like a manacle and congratulating her for getting Luca promoted. The ride in the armored SUV silent and suffocating as Celine was trapped between Dante and the window, locks engaged and glass bulletproof. Watching Manhattan's lights blur away toward a private Hampton's estate while her mind replayed the translation and the impossible choice it created. Until Dante finally asked who she was without looking at her, cleaning his gun with precise practiced movements as she hugged herself and said she was a waitress, prompting him to remark that waitresses don't read dead languages and reveal his team had run her face to find nothing for 3 years before uncovering Dr. Celine Rostova of Cambridge, disgraced for unethical decryption of classified government documents, making her flinch as she defended decoding the historical archive she didn't know was active. Dante musing about her disappearance and calling her smart but careless for speaking up, dismissing her protest about the 10 million with a dark chuckle about believing a mafia don. As the car slowed through iron gates, marked with a V, and wound through dark forest to a limestone mansion fortress, Dante laying out the deal that Luca was in a holding cell and she lived only if he confessed, her insisting she hadn't lied, and the text was clear before a guard opened the door and hauled her out. Dante didn't offer a hand and simply walked toward the massive double doors, expecting her to follow, and she considered running into the dark woods until the red laser dot on her chest from a sniper on the roof changed her mind and she followed him inside, where the foyer was breathtaking with marble floors, a chandelier the size of a car, and art that belonged in the Louvre. But Celine only had eyes for the security cameras everywhere, guards at every exit, as Dante ordered a maid who appeared from the shadows to take her to the blue room, lock the door, and give her anything she wanted to eat but no phone and no internet. Celine calling out to wait as the maid took her arm and asking what happened to her now. Dante pausing on the grand staircase and looking down at her with an expression that softened for a fleeting second, revealing a man burdened by the weight of a crown he never asked for as he said, "Now Selene, you pray that you are as smart as you think you are." Because that letter, that was page 1, before turning and disappearing upstairs, leaving her in the blue room, which was actually a luxurious guest suite with barred windows, where Selene paced until her feet hurt. Hours passing as she found a change of clothes, expensive silk pajamas that fit her surprisingly well, showered to wash the smell of the restaurant and fear off her skin, though the anxiety remained. Until it was past 3 a.m. when the lock clicked and Selene scrambled off the bed, backing against the headboard as Dante entered, changed out of his suit into a black button-down shirt and trousers. Exhausted, a smear of blood on his cuff that wasn't there before, holding a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses as he kicked the door shut and said, "Drink," pouring the glass and holding it out. Selene refusing to drink with kidnappers, and Dante repeating, "Drink," his voice strained, saying it was a celebration. Her hesitating before taking the glass with shaking hands as Dante downed his own drink in one gulp and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness, quietly saying Luca talked his best friend, the man who taught him how to shoot, the man he trusted with his life, turning back with hollow eyes to explain. Luca had been skimming from the accounts for years and selling his movements to the Bratva. The Russians, Selene gasping and apologizing only for Dante to snap not to be, telling her she saved him and that tonight they were planning a hit, and if he hadn't left the restaurant when he did, if she hadn't read that warning, trailing off as he sat on the edge of the bed far too close, the smell of whiskey and gunpowder clinging to him while he said she earned her keep. Selene asking if that meant she got the 10 million, and Dante laughing genuinely and saying no. She didn't get the money, her telling him to let her go and him saying he couldn't, explaining why as he pulled out the parchment and unfolded it on the bedspread between them, pointing to the bottom of the page and revealing, beneath the signature, another microscopic line in different ink she hadn't noticed before. Dante asking what it was, and Selene squinting as her blood ran cold, whispering it was a coordinate encrypted with a double blind cipher, the devil's tongue code thought. Unbreakable during the Cold War, Dante asking if she could break it and Selene saying she might with a week or 2. Dante shaking his head that they didn't have 2 weeks because Luca confessed something else before he died. Selene swallowing hard as Dante said Luca told the Russians he had the parchment and told them about the waitress who could read it. Dante closing the heavy velvet drapes and explaining there was a 10 million bounty on the translation, but now a 20 million bounty on her head. Turning back grimly to tell her she was not his prisoner anymore, but his asset, and until she cracked the code they were stuck together. Selene asking where, and Dante answering on the run and telling her to pack because they knew where they were. And as if on cue, a massive explosion rocked the house, glass shattering against iron bars as alarms wailed, and Dante tackled Selene onto the mattress, covering her body with his as bullets shredded the room, and he whispered, "Welcome to the family," into her hair. The world not going black, but white, a blinding, searing white that erased a luxurious bedroom. The heavy velvet drapes, and the man before her, followed by a sound that wasn't a boom, but a physical blow to the eardrums. A pressure wave sucking the air out of Selene's lungs and slamming it back with the taste of drywall and smoke as Selene lay curled on the floor, cheek pressed to the rough fibers of the Persian rug, ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world. Coughing as pain lanced through her ribs, something heavy shifted above her, and the command to stay down was less a sound than a vibration against her spine. Dante covering her with his body, a human shield arched over her smaller frame to absorb the impact of falling debris as he groaned. A low guttural sound of pain before rolling off her, and Selene scrambled to her hands and knees, blinking through the haze of plaster dust as the room resolved into chaos, unrecognizable. The heavy oak door blown clean off its hinges and the hallway beyond glowing inferno orange, flames licking the ceiling and throwing dancing, demonic shadows across the walls. Cellini choking out Dante's name as he was already moving, rising into a crouch and shaking debris from his dark hair like a wolf shedding water. Blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow to carve a crimson line down his cheek. Yet his eyes were clear and focused, and terrifyingly calm as he checked the clip of his gun and slid it back into place with a metallic click that sounded unnaturally loud over the roar of the fire. Asking if she could run as he grabbed her arm with a bruising, desperate grip, Cellini stammering that she thought so. Legs trembling, and Dante snapping not to think but to do as he hauled her upright and barked instructions, "Stay behind me. Hold on to my belt. If I stop, you stop. If I shoot, you cover your ears. Do you understand?" Accepting her yes with a curt "good girl" before kicking aside what remained of the doorframe and stepping into the burning hallway where the heat pressed like a solid wall reeking of melting plastic and expensive wood. The automatic fire suppression system failed, sabotaged. Cellini's analytical mind frantically cataloging the disaster structural damage to the east wing. Fire spreading at approximately 10 feet per minute. Exit options limited, when a figure emerged from the smoke at the end of the hall. A silhouette gripping an assault rifle, Cellini barely managing a gasp before Dante raised his arm and fired twice. Pop, pop, efficient and muted, the figure crumpling as Dante never slowed. Stepping over the body without looking while Cellini did. Unable to help herself, noting the tactical gear and unfamiliar shoulder patch. Not police but mercenaries, Dante ordering her not to look as he yanked her forward and told her to keep moving. Reaching the grand staircase only to find its lower half collapsed into a foyer-turned war zone. Bullets chipping marble near Cellini's head as she screamed and ducked low. Dante growling that they were coming through the front and pivoting to Plan B. Spinning her around and dragging her to a narrow servant's door hidden in the wall paneling. Punching a code into a concealed keypad as the panel slid open to reveal a dark, spiraling concrete staircase descending into the earth. Shoving her inside and telling her to go as she cried out asking where it led. Dante answering the wine cellar then the tunnels and ordering her to move as he slammed the panels shut behind them. Plunging them into pitch darkness broken only by their ragged breathing until a click sounded and a tactical flashlight beam cut through the black. Dante taking the stairs two at a time and pulling her along as the air turned cool and damp. Smelling of mold and old cork in stark contrast to the burning hell above. Reaching the bottom where Dante navigated the maze of wine racks by memory rather than sight and stopped at a heavy iron door. Unlocking it with a key from around his neck and pushing them into a garage that resembled a concrete bunker more than anything else. A single car inside, a matte black vintage Aston Martin clearly modified. Dante ordering her to get in as Cellini threw herself into the cold leather passenger seat. Dante sliding into the driver's side and tossing the gun onto his lap. Keying the ignition as the engine roared to life with a feral growl echoing off the concrete walls. Telling her to buckle up because this part got rough. Hitting a button on the dashboard as the wall in front of them began to rise. Revealing a concealed exit into the dense forest around the estate. The car surging forward with tires screeching as Cellini looked back to see the mansion, the golden cage burning like a torch against the night sky. Flames bursting from the roof and illuminating the trees while dozens of men swarmed the lawn like ants on a carcass. Cellini whispering in shock that they destroyed it and calling it his home, Dante never looking back. Knuckles white on the steering wheel and jaw clenched, so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek as he said without sentiment that it wasn't a home. Just a building, and he had plenty of buildings. Slamming his foot on the gas as the car rocketed down the narrow forest road. Tearing through underbrush and leaving fire and the life Cellini knew behind. Cellini watching his profile in the dim dashboard light, composed almost bored. Yet seeing the tremor in his left hand, the one not on the wheel, realizing he wasn't made of stone, only better at hiding the cracks, the drive stretching on for hours in a heavy, thick silence filling the small cabin as Dante avoided highways and stuck to winding back roads, cutting through the sleeping towns of upstate New York. The rain began an hour in, a relentless downpour that drummed against the roof and blurred the world outside into streaks of gray and black. And Selena's adrenaline faded, leaving behind a cold, shaking exhaustion as her ruined silk pajamas, stained with soot and dust, clung to her while she hugged her arms around herself, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. Dante noticing without speaking and simply reaching out to turn the heater up to the maximum setting. The blast of hot air a small mercy, and when she finally asked where they were going, her voice raspy, Dante replied nowhere. A ghost spot not on any deed or database, bought by his father under a shell company in the 80s for cash. Slowing the car and turning onto a gravel track, barely visible through overgrown pines. The car crunching over stones and twigs for a mile before stopping in front of a frame cabin near a dark lake that looked abandoned. No lights, no movement, just a shadow against the water. Dante telling her to wait as he got out with his gun and circled the perimeter while Selene watched through rain-streaked glass. His predator's grace evident as he checked windows, doors, the tree line, only returning when satisfied to open her door and say it was clear. The run to the porch soaking her to the bone. The inside freezing and smelling of cedar and stale air as Dante locked the door and immediately stacked logs and kindling in the fireplace with efficient movements. A fire crackling within minutes and casting a warm, flickering glow over the sparse room with its leather couch, heavy wooden table, and small kitchenette. Dante stripping off his soaked shirt and tossing it aside as Selene averted her eyes then looked back, gasping at the tapestry of scars across his back, old knife wounds, bullet grazes, fresh angry bruising from tonight's debris, and the deep gash on his shoulder still oozing blood. Her stepping forward to tell him he was hurt as he dismissed it as a scratch. Her insisting it needed stitches or at least cleaning. Dante grunting that he'd handle it as he grabbed vodka and a clean rag from the kitchen. Selena pointing out he couldn't reach it and stepping closer. Hesitation warring with logic until she told him to give it to her. Dante pausing to look at her in the firelight, eyes less stormy and more weary as he studied her hands and face before handing over the bottle and rag and sitting. Selene standing between his knees and ignoring the heat of his bare skin as she poured vodka on the cloth and warned it would sting, pressing it to the wound as Dante hissed and gripped his thighs until his knuckles whitened but didn't pull away. Selene cleaning carefully while overwhelmed by his scent of rain, musk and iron, the hardness of his muscles, the intimacy terrifying her more than gunfire as she asked softly why he'd covered her when the ceiling fell and he could have run. Dante silent for a long moment before saying she was the asset and the money was in her head. Selene stopping and looking up to ask if that was all. Dante's gaze flickering dangerously as he said, if she died he'd never know what his father was trying to tell him, and he hated unfinished puzzles. Abruptly breaking the tension and returning to business as he slammed the dry parchment onto the table and ordered her to work, explaining they were safe for tonight, but the Russians wouldn't stop and he needed to know where the reserves were. Selene sighing as the connection shattered and sitting to pull the oil lamp closer, smoothing the parchment and muttering about the devil's tongue while Dante leaned against the wall with cheap vodka and asked why it was called that. Selene shifting into academic mode to explain it twisted the truth. Developed by a rogue cryptographer in the 50s using a double-blind key where the symbols were a distraction and the real message lay in the spaces between them. Measuring gaps with a pencil and dusty notepad as she noted his father must have been brilliant and paranoid to use it. He was the capo di Carpi, Dante said, and paranoia was a job requirement. And Selene worked for an hour with the only sounds being the scratching of her pencil and the crackling fire while Dante didn't move. watching her with an intensity that made the back of her neck prickle, until she announced she had the first layer and rubbed her tired eyes. Dante at the table in a second, asking what it was. Celine explaining it was a sequence but not coordinates yet, a riddle. And at his command she read it aloud, where the sinner goes to wash his hands. But the water is always dry. Dante frowning that it made no sense. Guessing at church and being corrected as Celine shook her head and explained water that is dry was metaphorical or chemical. Dry ice. Dante pacing the small room and thinking aloud about a freezer or meat locker until Celine prompted him to think about his father. Where he went to think, to confess, to hide. Dante stopping and staring at the fire as pain mixed with realization crossed his face, and he whispered the confessional, correcting himself as he looked at her and explained it was the name of his father's private speakeasy in the basement of an old Brooklyn warehouse closed 10 years ago and supposedly bricked up. Celine asking about the dry water, and Dante answering with a dark smile that his father always drank his scotch neat. No water, no ice, looking at Celine with genuine respect in his eyes for the first time and admitting she was good. Her replying simply that she knew. Dante leaning across the table with his hands bracketing her notebook, entrapping her as he explained that if the money was in the old warehouse, they had a problem because Luca had sold that territory to the Russians 3 days ago, and they would have to break into the heart of enemy territory. Celine feeling the blood drain from her face as Dante told her she had to come because the cipher wasn't finished and there would be a lock and a combination hidden in the rest of the code. His thumb grazing her cheek to wipe away soot, in a touch that felt electric as he murmured she wasn't just a translator anymore but the key, and that he would get her into that warehouse even if he had to burn the rest of the city down. Celine looking at the dangerous, beautiful man who had kidnapped her and saved her, and realizing she didn't want to run anymore because the puzzle and the man had her hooked. Whispering, "Then let's burn it down." Morning breaking over the lake in pale bruised purples and grays as the rain stopped and the world dripped in silence. The cabin fire burned to embers as Celine woke with a stiff neck at the table with her head on a notebook filled with cipher sequences. Panic spiking when she found the cabin empty and feared he'd left or the Russians had found them. Spinning at the sound of his voice telling her to drink this, and seeing Dante in the doorway blocking the morning light. Hair damp from outside and holding 2 steaming paper cups. Changed now with the wild edge gone and replaced by icy focus. Freshly shaved with a dull razor and looking less like a fugitive and more like a CEO about to launch a hostile takeover. Celine asking if it was coffee and Dante replying black. No sugar, that they needed caffeine not comfort. Setting the cup by her notebook and examining her work as he asked if she finished the sequence. Celine saying yes and sipping bitter coffee that burned her tongue awake as she explained the riddle, pointed to the basement, the north wall behind the sinner's seat. Dante confirming that was the bar stool, his father's favorite. But noting getting to it was the problem as he tossed a folded local newspaper onto the table with the headline, "Valerio estate destroyed in gas explosion, no survivors." Celine whispering they thought they were dead and Dante correcting that they hoped so, and that it was their only advantage because the Russians had taken over the warehouse and were hosting a victory gala, turning the ground floor into a high-end underground casino. Explaining they were going to walk in not as Dante Valerio and the waitress, but as Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood. Oil money from Texas, boring, rich and invisible. Kicking a duffel bag Celine hadn't noticed and telling her to put the contents on as a favor called in. Celine opening it to find a dress that was a weapon made of fabric, floor-length, backless. Midnight blue silk like liquid water with diamond earrings and a tuxedo beside it. Celine touching the silk and saying she couldn't wear it because she was just Celine. And she spilled coffee. I trip over my own feet as Dante walked around the table and stopped behind her close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. not touching her yet, making the air between them grow heavy, and he said Selena Rostova is dead in a low, hypnotic voice near her ear, that she died in the fire. That tonight she's not a waitress, but the wife of a billionaire. Arrogant and bored, looking at everyone in that room as if they are beneath her. His hand hovering over her shoulder before he finally let himself touch her. Fingers brushing the stray hairs at the nape of her neck as he told her, she has the mind of a genius and to stop acting like a servant, because tonight she is a queen and must act like one. The command sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear as she turned to face him and asked if he could play the part of a loving husband. Dante's eyes darkening as he looked at her mouth and then back to her eyes and murmured that it would be the easiest lie he'd ever told. And 3 hours later, Celine stood before the cracked bathroom mirror, unsettled by the transformation. Hair swept into an elegant twist, diamonds glittering at her ears, blue silk molding to her curves like a second skin as she applied the deep blood-red lipstick Dante had provided and walked out to find him waiting, adjusting the cuff links on his tuxedo and freezing when he looked up. The silence stretching thick and taut as he didn't smile or compliment her, but simply stared with a possessive gaze that made her knees weak and said mine. Celine asking if she would do in a trembling voice as Dante crossed to her, pulled a small lethal-looking pistol from his pocket and told her to strap it to her thigh under the dress, explaining she didn't need to aim and if someone touched her to press it to their stomach and pull the trigger. Offering his arm and saying the car was waiting and it was showtime, Mrs. Blackwood. The warehouse now christened the Foundry, pulsing with bass so deep it rattled Celine's teeth. Cold Brooklyn night outside and hot air inside, smelling of expensive perfume. Sweat and ozone, the industrial space transformed with red velvet ropes, chandeliers on rusted steel beams, and green felt tables where millions changed hands as Dante moved with a lazy, arrogant swagger, unlike his usual predatory stalk. Thick-rimmed glasses and a slouched posture masking military-grade alertness. His arm wrapped around Celine's waist and hand possessive on her hip as he leaned in every few minutes to whisper what looked like lovers' secrets but were tactical updates about guards and cameras while telling her to keep smiling. Celine laughing as if at a joke and whispering back that her face hurt from smiling. Dante telling her to drink her champagne, not look at the guards and to look at him. And behind the glasses his blue eyes scanned every face as they stood deep in enemy territory among Russian mobsters with Viktor Vulov at the center table. A bear of a man laughing over chips, Dante murmuring his name and that he sat right on top of the trap door. Celine asking how they moved him and Dante saying they didn't. They caused a distraction as he checked his watch and explained the kitchen fire alarm would malfunction and smoke would give them their window. Celine's heart hammering as he added that if it didn't work, they'd shoot their way out or die. A shout erupting as black smoke poured from the kitchen and alarms shrieked fire. Panic rippling as mobsters reached for holsters and patrons shoved for exits. Dante saying now and guiding her calmly against the flow into the VIP shadows toward the bar where Vulov had been, vaulting the mahogany and telling her to hurry behind it as she scrambled and tore her dress without caring. Landing behind the bar as Dante hissed about the wall and the north wall. Celine scanning the bricks and spotting the faint discoloration matching the Gregorian shift where the sinner goes to wash his hands. Pressing the bricks and saying here, 3, 7, 1. And pushing them in that order. A heavy thunk echoed as the section of wall, actually a concealed steel door, faced with brick clicked open an inch. And Dante hooked his fingers into the gap and hauled it wide. Darkness yawning beyond as he ordered her to get in. The two of them slipping inside while he pulled the door shut, just as a flashlight beam swept across the bar outside, plunging them into total darkness filled with stale air that smelled of dust and old tobacco. Dante clicking on a small pen light to reveal a tiny windowless room lined with empty shelves, a single metal desk at its center, and a heavy, archaic-looking safe. Dante whispering the confessional like he was greeting a ghost as he approached the safe, and saw it had no digital pad, but a dial with letters instead of numbers. Sighing that it was another cipher and turning to Celine to tell her it was all her and they had maybe 5 minutes before the fire was deemed small and they came back for the cash. Celine stepping forward and shining the light on the Greek letters of the dial. Closing her eyes to visualize the parchment, the bottom line. The microscopic text she'd translated in the cabin. Correcting herself that the key wasn't the Golda's bloodline, but the signature. Amor Gabriella, whispering Gabriella, and realizing it wasn't just a name but the key. Converting it to Greek and shifting it by the date of her death, as she asked Dante for the exact date. October 14th, his voice tight as he stood by the door with his gun drawn listening to muffled shouts outside. Celine muttering 1014 as she spun the dial gamma, alpha. Beta, her fingers slick with sweat as the mechanism clicked and groaned, and she pleaded under her breath before entering the final character and gasping as the handle released. Dante instantly at her side, yanking the steel door open as they stared inside expecting cash or gold or diamonds, only to find the safe empty except for a single leather-bound ledger and a small silver USB drive. Celine's voice trembling as she asked where the money was while Dante flipped the ledger open and went pale, saying it wasn't money but leverage. Explaining the book held the names of every corrupt judge, politician, and police chief on the East Coast, and the drive likely contained bank codes to offshore accounts hiding bribes. Telling her it wasn't 10 million but billions. The keys to the kingdom and the reason his father was killed. The secret room door suddenly shaking as someone pounded outside shouting in Russian to open up. Dante shoving the ledger and drive into his waistband and grabbing Celine's face, rough and desperate. Telling her there was a ventilation shaft behind the shelf leading to the alley. Celine insisting they split up and Dante refusing as she grabbed his lapels, and he told her they wanted him, not her, and that if one of them got out they could destroy them while sparks flew from a cutting torch, slicing the lock and the hinges buckled. Dante kissing her hard and searing, champagne and danger on his lips. Pulling back to tell her to run and not look back as he shoved her toward the shelf and kicked it aside to reveal the narrow vent. Celine crawling inside with tears streaming and looking back one last time to see Dante Valerio standing in the center of the room facing the door. Gun raised and a dark smile on his lips as the steel gave way, and she heard him snarl, "Come and get it," before gunfire filled the room. The vent tight and reeking of rot as she crawled until her knees bled and kicked out a grate to tumble into a rain-slicked alley. The gunfire inside stopping and leaving a silence worse than noise, the silence of a grave. Celine gripping the silver USB drive so tightly it bit into her palm as she fought the urge to run back and scream his name. The cold, analytical part of her mind taking over to remind her that Dante gave her the codes and made himself the decoy, and that if she went back his sacrifice meant nothing, and that Selena Rostova, the shy waitress, died in that alley. The woman who stood up was someone else entirely as she pulled her torn silk dress around her, wiped the tears and soot from her face, and vanished into the shadows of Brooklyn. And 48 hours later, the meeting took place at a private airfield in New Jersey where the rain had returned in a relentless gray drizzle coating the tarmac. Viktor Vulov standing by a sleek private jet surrounded by 6 armed guards looking smug because he believed he had won. He had the territory, he had the ledger, and he had the hostage. As 2 guards dragged a figure from the back of a black SUV, Donna barely recognizable with his face swollen, one eye sealed shut, his shirt torn and bloodied, stumbling and falling to his knees on the wet asphalt as he rasped Celine's name in a broken voice, warning her not to come out because it was a trap, only for Vulov to kick him in the ribs and send him sprawling while calling into the empty hangar for the little mouse to come out because he had her Wolf and she had his key and it was time to make a trade. And then from the shadows a figure emerged, and it wasn't a mouse at all, as Celine walked onto the tarmac in a beige trench coat. Her hair slicked back, posture rigid, looking bored rather than terrified as she announced she was there. Vulov holding out his meaty hand demanding the drive in exchange for Dante's life. Celine calmly refusing and stopping 10 feet away while Vulov laughed and pressed a gun to Dante's head, threatening to shoot him as Dante pleaded with his one good eye for her to run. Celine not blinking as she pulled a tablet from her coat and coldly informed Vulov the drive was empty because she had uploaded the decryption keys to a secure cloud server an hour earlier and set a daemon protocol so that if she didn't enter a biometric code every 5 minutes, the entire ledger, every name, every bribe, every murder would be emailed to the FBI, the CIA, and Interpol's Russian oligarch division. Stepping forward to explain that killing him, killing her, or taking the tablet would all trigger it as Vulov's face turned purple, and he accused her of lying only for her to smirk and tell him to check his phone because she had just sent a sample to his personal email. The list of skimming operations he'd hidden from his own bosses in Moscow. Watching his face go pale as he lowered the gun and hissed what she wanted. Celine pointing to Dante and ordering Vulov to walk him over and then leave New York forever. Vulov grinding his teeth before signaling his guards to release Dante, who groaned and limped toward Celine until he collapsed against her, whispering that she was crazy and her whispering back that she learned from the best. Vulov screaming for the code only for Celine to smile with the same dark expression Dante once wore and admit she lied about the timer because there was no timer and the files were already sent. Sirens wailing as blue and red lights crested the hill and SWAT trucks smashed through the fence. Vulov roaring as gunfire erupted between his men and the agents while Celine dragged Dante behind fuel drums and then through a service exit to a waiting sedan, shoving him inside and speeding away as Dante laughed painfully, full of life, saying she burned them all and Celine replying she didn't like unfinished puzzles, Mahor. And 6 months later on a terrace overlooking the Amalfi Coast with lemon trees in bloom, Dante Valerio sat reading a newspaper. His scars faded to thin white lines, peaceful at last, as Celine joined him with 2 espressos in a white sundress and eyes of steel. Dante telling her Vulov received 3 life sentences and musing playfully that she never finished the job because he never paid her the 10 million. Celine reminding him of the offer and Dante shrugging that he no longer had it because he froze all the assets when they went legitimate. I'm just a boring vineyard owner now. That's a shame. Celine sighed, leaning back. I guess I'll have to settle for something else. Oh? Dante leaned forward, his voice dropping to that familiar, dangerous purr. And what is that? Celine smiled, leaning in until their lips were inches apart. Your silence, Mr. Valerio. I'll give you a lifetime if you just shut up and kiss me. Dante Valerio, the man who laughed at threats and silenced rooms with a glare, did exactly as he was told. And that is how a shy waitress outsmarted the deadliest men in the underworld. Because Celine didn't just translate a cipher, she rewrote her own destiny. And in the end, the $10 million didn't matter. The real treasure wasn't the gold hidden in the vault or the leverage in the ledger. It was the partner she found in the fire. And they proved that while violence can conquer a city, only intelligence can conquer a war. That Dante found the one thing more dangerous than a gun. A woman who knows exactly what he's thinking. And they escaped the game by breaking the board. Proving that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should fear the most. And I hope you enjoyed this twist-filled mafia romance saga. Because if you did, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And here's a question for you. If you found a secret code that could topple a crime syndicate, would you try to solve it for $10 million, or would you run the other way? Let me know your answer in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next story.